It started on a crisp autumn night, just after midnight. A cold fog rolled in over Ashfield Cemetery, draping the crumbling headstones and weeping willows in an eerie mist. At first it was just a few graves. The packed dirt began to shift and tremble. Then it burst open, like the earth itself was exhaling a putrid breath. Clumps of soil and sod were violently pushed aside as skeletal hands clawed their way to the surface. Within minutes, every burial plot was erupting. Coffin lids were flung into the air as the newly reanimated corpses fought their way out of the ground. Hundreds of them, bodies in varying states of decay, dressed in tattered burial clothes and draped in cobwebs and grime. Their empty eye sockets seemed to stare unblinking into the fog as they pulled their desiccated forms free of the soil. Across town, Sarah McDermott was awake dealing with a sleepless toddler. Her son Liam had been fussy all night with a fever. She was gently rocking him in the old wooden chair by the window when the first faint moans reached her ears. At first, she thought it was just the gusting autumn wind, but the sounds grew louder and more unsettling, a great chorus of gravelly groans, groaning in time like the guides pulling together on some infernal oars. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. She quickly tucked Liam back into his crib and threw open the curtains. In the backyard, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the porch light, she saw them. Dozens of figures shambling across the frost-covered grass, leaving trails of grave dirt and broken twigs in their wake. She gasped and instinctively stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth. These things looked like something out of a Night of the Living Dead movie. Hunched and disfigured, flesh peeling away from their bones, trailing desiccated organs and tattered funeral attire in their path. They seemed to be converging on the house from all directions, low groans and unintelligible snarls emanating from their decayed throats. Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed the window shut and pulled the drapes, her heart pounding in her ears. Oh, God, what is happening? She raced into the hallway, scooped up her cell phone, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. Please pick up, please. But there was no answer, just a tone indicating that all circuits were busy. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't the only one calling about these things. Maybe emergency services were already being deployed. That hope was short-lived. A heavy thump echoed from the front of the house, like someone or something running into the door. It was followed by a chorus of blood-curdling moans and growls. Sarah froze, phone trembling in her hand. Another series of dull thuds, and the front door shuddered violently on its hinges. Oh, God, they're trying to get in, Sarah cried out loud. She turned and ran into the kitchen, stabbing at her phone again to call her husband Greg at work. Please pick up, she thought frantically as she could hear the door starting to crack and splinter in the other room. Come on, Greg, pick up, she pleaded through gritted teeth, but it just rang and rang until going to voicemail. She slammed the phone down on the counter, trying not to panic. Outside, she could hear the heavy thumps getting closer and the sounds of shattering glass as the creatures started smashing through the windows. Sarah snapped into action, her protective maternal instincts overriding her fear. She ran to grab Liam's car seat carrier, then raced back into his bedroom. The boy was wailing at the cacophony of terrifying sounds. Sarah scooped him up and hugged him close for just a second, trying to keep her voice calm and steady. It's okay, baby. We're okay. Mama's got you, she whispered into his soft auburn hair, her own voice trembling with equal parts fear and determination. She strapped him into the carrier, then grabbed the heavy diaper bag and slung it over her other shoulder. From the living room came a deafening crash and a chorus of guttural moans as the front door was bashed open. Sarah gasped and hurried into the bathroom, slamming and locking the door behind her. She took a deep breath, heart pounding, and scanned the room. There, a small window, barely big enough to crawl through. Their only chance. With Liam tucked into the crook of one arm, she grabbed the heavy ceramic trash can and swung it at the window, grunting with exertion. The thick glass shattered, showering the tile with jagged shards. She leaned in and frantically cleared away the remaining shards with her free hand, wincing as they sliced into her skin. In the other room she could hear heavy footsteps, thudding and dragging across the floor. Was it her mind playing tricks, or were those sickening grunts and groans getting closer? Sarah didn't wait to find out. She hoisted Liam's carrier up onto the windowsill, then grabbed a towel and wrapped it around her arms as makeshift protection against the jagged glass. Steeling herself, she climbed up, clutching the straps of the carrier tightly, and contorted her body to push through the narrow opening. Shards of glass sliced into her back and legs as she wriggled and squirmed, but she kept pushing, gritting her teeth against the burning pain. Finally, with one last desperate shove, she tumbled out onto the cold ground outside, still tightly clutching Liam. The baby was screaming now, his little face bright red. "Shh, shh, we're okay. I've got you," Sarah soothed through ragged breaths, tears of relief and terror streaming down her face. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing cuts on her arms and legs. Her heart nearly stopped when she turned and saw more of those things, shuffling toward her from the shadows between the houses. "No, no!" she cried out, clutching Liam close. She could feel the carrier trembling in her arms as he continued to wail in fear and confusion. "No! You keep away from us!" The creatures, more like walking corpses, their bodies disfigured by decay, didn't seem fazed. They kept coming, dead white eyes staring blindly, cracked jaws opening and closing as they released hoarse, rasping groans. Sarah could smell them now, the overwhelming stench of rot and putrescence. It was like nothing she'd ever experienced, a sickly sweet blend of decaying meat, spoiled milk, and brackish water. Sarah gagged against the overpowering reek and turned to run. Clutching Liam tight, she bolted down the dark street toward the sounds of more commotion in the distance. What she saw made her heart sink. There were more of those shambling forms everywhere, in yards, lurching down sidewalks and alleyways, converging on homes and businesses alike. And in every direction, screams. Tortured cries for help piercing the night, swiftly choked off in gurgles and sickening bursts of violent struggles. She watched in stunned horror as a young woman, a neighbour she vaguely recognized, came running around the corner. The poor woman's eyes were wild with panic, her blouse and jeans soaked in blood. She was clutching a nasty bite wound on her neck, leaving a thick smear of crimson across her pale skin. 3 of the undead pursued her, their bony fingers grasping and their jaws snapping eagerly. The creatures caught up to her barely 20 feet from where Sarah stood frozen. The first one slammed into the woman from behind, bony arms locking around her in a parody of a grotesque embrace. She screamed and thrashed, kicking with all her might, but 2 more of the ghouls were already on her. Sarah saw their cracked, lichen-encrusted teeth sink into the soft flesh of the woman's shoulder with a horrible squishing sound. Then her screams were drowned out in a torrent of blood that burst from her throat. Sarah tore her eyes away, fighting the urge to vomit. But the wet, tearing sounds and gurgling gasps followed her like a waking nightmare no matter how quickly she ran. Before long, the streets were full of those hellish sounds mingled with the screams, and the pungent stench of decay hung like a thick miasma. She ran with no destination in mind, just fleeing through the suburban maze of tree-lined streets until her legs and lungs burned. Liam was still screaming, his tiny voice hoarse now from the exertion. The diaper bag bounced and scraped against Sarah's back, the contents spilling onto the pavement. A shadow loomed ahead, the town's old stone library standing resolute and silent among the chaos. Its heavy oak doors looked reassuringly solid, the windows still dark and unbroken. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran up the broad steps, fumbling with the ornate door handles until the thick slabs of carved wood swung open with a groan of protest. She hurried inside, relief flooding her veins to be shut away from the nightmare unfolding outside. The library was still and quiet, for now. A sanctuary, however temporary. She rested her head back against the door, panting for breath. Liam was still wailing, his little face beet red. She hushed him and pressed a tender kiss to his forehead, rocking the carrier gently as tears streaked down her ash-smeared cheeks. "It's okay. It's okay," she whispered through gasping sobs. "We're safe. For now." But as she sank to the floor, surrounded by the comforting smell of books and dust, she saw the trail of bloody footprints she'd tracked in, and knew it was only a matter of time. Sarah didn't allow herself to rest for long. Her heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she knew she needed to take stock of their situation. Liam had finally cried himself into an uneasy slumber, his little face blotchy and streaked with tears. Sarah gently set down his carrier and shrugged off the diaper bag, wincing at the fiery pain in her shoulders and back from the cuts and gouges. She pulled a small flashlight from the bag and flicked it on, sweeping the beam around the darkened lobby. The vaulted ceiling rose high above in shadowy arches, the faint light filtering through the tall arched windows, barely illuminating the carved trim and rich wooden banisters. Bookshelves stood in long rows, their tomes neatly arranged and undisturbed, at least for now. Sarah moved cautiously down the main hallway, away from the entrance and its telltale trail of bloody footprints and smeared dirt. Her own ragged breathing was the only sound apart from Liam's occasional fitful whimpers. Her aim was the main reading room at the heart of the old building. Maybe she could find a way to barricade them inside, hole up and try to get some rest until what? She shook her head, trying to suppress her rising panic. One problem at a time. The heavy oak door to the reading room was slightly ajar. Sarah nudged it open further, the beam of her flashlight scanning the cavernous space. It was empty and undisturbed, just as she'd hoped. Rows of soft reading chairs and sturdy oak tables filled the center of the room, while the walls were lined with more shelves of books and magazines. To her right, behind a long, curving desk, was the research office where the librarians worked. The office door was standing open, a faint light glowing from within. "Hello," Sarah called out in a shaky voice. Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the faint hum of the old building's ventilation system and the thud of her own racing heartbeat. She nudged the door open further with her foot and swept the flashlight beam inside. There they were, two figures lying crumpled on the floor amidst scattered papers and overturned chairs. Mrs. Appleton, the kindly old head librarian, and Jamie, one of the college kids who worked at the front desk after classes. Both were very clearly dead, their bodies contorted in unmistakable horror. Glassy eyes stared up blankly at the ceiling, their faces frozen in masks of agony. Sarah recoiled, choking back a startled cry. She fumbled for the desk lamp and snapped it on, revealing the full grisly scene. Both bodies bore vicious slashes and bite marks, their tattered clothing soaked with congealed blood. Tufts of grey hair were gripped in Mrs. Appleton's gnarled fist, evidence of her futile struggle. Her throat had been torn wide open, the flesh ripped away to expose the pale column of her windpipe. Sarah gagged, slapping a hand over her mouth at the sickly copper stench. She fell back a step, nearly tripping over Jamie's corpse sprawled in the doorway. The poor girl, no older than 20, she realized with a lurch of horror. Her face was frozen in a rictus of fear, one arm outstretched towards the door, towards the hopes of escape that clearly never came. Her throat and torso were a butchered ruin of torn flesh and protruding bone. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea and revulsion that threatened to drown her. She knew she should leave, put as much distance between herself and this massacre as possible. But some morbid fascination kept her rooted in place, her light shaking as she swept it around the room once more. That's when she saw it. A message written in Mrs. Appleton's shaky hand, the blood already turning brown and flaking. "Run! They kill! Run!" A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she looked from the message to the mutilated remains. Her gaze fell on the heavy steel letter opener lying in the pool of congealed blood. She didn't know what compelled her in that moment. Perhaps just the numbing instinct for self-preservation, or the urge to have some means of defending herself and Liam. Whatever the reason, she reached down with a trembling hand and retrieved the opener. She gripped it tightly, the stark realization hitting her. This was a weapon now, a weapon to use against what? What kind of hellish evil had been unleashed on the world while she slept? She felt her last fragile grasp on reality started to slip away, replaced with a rising storm of panic and terror. Sarah quickly retreated back to the reading room, scooping up Liam's carrier. She chose one of the sturdy oak tables and upended it on its side, then began dragging some of the high-backed chairs into place, fashioning a makeshift barricade of solid furniture. She didn't know if it would stop those things, but at least it was some feeble protection. With shaking hands, she fastened the thick curtains hanging over the tall windows and blocked every possible entry point she could find. When she was finally satisfied with her meagre fortifications, she huddled down behind the barricade, clutching Liam tightly. Only then did she allow the wavering dam of her emotions to break. Great, heaving sobs racked her body as the reality of their horrific circumstances came crashing down. She wept for the poor souls who'd suffered those grisly fates in the library office. She cried tears of agonizing worry for Greg. Her husband was still out there somewhere amidst that chaos, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding, and she wept for the terrifying uncertainty of what was yet to come for her and Liam. Were they destined to die here in this mausoleum of books, torn apart by those shambling horrors? Her gasping sobs eventually dissolved into hollow, rasping breaths that burned her raw throat. She rocked Liam gently, chastising herself for her moment of utter surrender to despair. She had to be stronger, had to retain some sense of hope, however faint, for her son's sake. As night gave way to the pale light of a sullen dawn filtering through the heavy curtains, Sarah felt her inner reserves of fortitude slowly rebuild. She rose stiffly and moved to rummage through the diaper bag, retrieving her phone once more. Still no signal. The towers were likely damaged or overloaded. Some tiny part of her had been hoping for a miracle, reassuring messages or a voice of authority offering guidance or salvation. But there was only dead silence. She was utterly alone, cut off from the outside world. Sarah busied herself with checking on Liam, forcing a brave smile as his bright blue eyes fluttered open. He seemed blissfully unaware of the terrifying maelstroms swirling around them, nestled in the warm cocoon of his carrier. Sarah gently stroked his downy wisps of hair as he drifted back into a restless sleep, his rosebud lips parting in a tiny O of contentment. She looked around at the shadowy shelves, lined with countless books containing all the accumulated knowledge, tales and wisdom of the ages. What good was any of it now in the face of this unspeakable darkness she could scarcely comprehend? Still, force of habit drove her to begin methodically scanning the spines, looking for anything that could shed light on the walking nightmare unfolding around them. She found little of use, a few academic tomes on epidemiology and pandemics that she rifled through in vain. There were also some well-worn paperbacks containing anthologies of classic horror stories and ghost tales. Sarah tossed them aside with a sad shake of her head. Their quaint depictions of things that went bump in the night held no truths that could help her now. A heavy thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by a chorus of gurgling moans and the brittle rasp of something being dragged across the tiled floor. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat as every muscle in her body went rigid. She strained her ears, willing her rapidly thrumming heartbeat to be still. More sounds followed, drawing closer it seemed. Heavy footfalls, indistinct groans, the clatter of something hard striking the shelves and bookcases. Liam stirred at the noise, his brow furrowing in a troubled frown. Sarah quickly shushed him and scooped up the carrier, scurrying back behind the barricade. She huddled down into the corner, wrapping her arms tightly around the carrier and holding her breath. Every percussive thud against the floorboards made her flinch, her wild eyes scanning for any sign of movement on the other side of the stacks. Closer and closer the noises drew, like some shambling hunting party inexorably closing the distance. Finally, a shape lurched into view amidst the shadowy shelves of the main foyer. Even wrapped in tattered funeral rags, caked in dirt and grime, Sarah instantly recognized the desiccated features. It was old Mr. Crenshaw, a neighborhood fixture who'd lived down the street for as long as she could remember. Or rather, what was left of him. The walking cadaver wore the sleepwear and bathrobe he'd been laid to rest in, the baby blue garments now stiff and brown with grave dirt. Scraps of desiccated flesh still clung to his protruding bones in ribbons, their colour taking on a sickly greenish-black hue of rot. His jaw worked mechanically, sagging open and closed in a rhythmic motion, releasing a sibilant stream of parched groans. The two clouded orbs where his eyes should have been stared sightlessly ahead as he dragged first one foot, then the other, in a grotesque lurching gait. Right behind him lurched another horror, the semi-liquefied remains of what looked like a middle-aged woman, the sparse strands of copper hair still clinging to her skull, the only indicator of her identity. What was left of her, morgue-pale flesh, seemed to be sloughing off her bones. She was dressed in a soiled nightgown, the floral pattern long since obliterated into an abstract mess of dried fluids and graveyard detritus. A jagged rent in her abdomen gaped open, spilling ruined organs and viscera with each stilted step. Sarah clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle her scream of revulsion and terror. The two putrid, reanimated corpses weren't alone. A veritable procession of the undead followed them in a stumbling, groaning chorus. A desiccated old man in a stained dress suit and tattered overcoat, his leg bones poking through the rotted remnants of his trousers. A younger figure, perhaps a woman in her 30s, judging from the maternity dress tangled amidst congealed ropes of decayed organs and flesh trailing behind her shuffling footsteps. They moved as one hunched, shambling mass, congregating in the centre of the lobby with a symphony of phlegmy wheezes and disjointed snapping of jaws. Caught in the beam of sunlight filtering through the tall windows, Sarah saw them fully illuminated in all their grotesque glory. Stringy sinews and tattered flesh peeled back from skeletal limbs and empty rib cages. Lips had long since sloughed away, leaving their cracked jaws gaping in eternal silent howls. The steady drip and splatter of ichorous fluids marked their lurching path. Sarah's mind reeled, unable to process what she was seeing. How was this possible? These things looked like they'd been disinterred from their graves months, years ago. Their bodies were ravaged far beyond what mere putrefaction should allow, and yet here they were, animated by some ungodly force, moving with a singular, dreadful purpose. She shrank deeper into the corner and tightened her arms around Liam as the groaning, animated corpses began to fan out into the reading room. She stifled a whimper as bony hands brushed against the barricaded table, pawing and scraping against the solid oak with desiccated fingers. Inch by inch, They were surrounding her feeble sanctuary, their decaying faces turned blindly in her direction, as if drawn by some primal sense straight to its source. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaking down her face. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some horrific waking nightmare she would rouse herself from at any moment. She yearned for the sweet release of waking with a terrified start, her heart pounding, but blessedly safe in her own bed. Instead, the shuffling footsteps and gurgling moans grew ever closer, forcing their way into her every sense. A new noise made her eyes snap open in dread. A heavy thump, followed by a splintering crack of wood. She stifled a scream as the upended table barricade shuddered, the leading edges of rotted arms and hands already snaking through the narrow opening they were creating. Within the knot of dread constricting her chest, a cold kernel of realization took form. This wasn't some hellish dream. This was undeniably real. There would be no waking from this nightmare. Sarah cradled Liam tight, her numb fingers gripping the letter opener like a talisman. Hot tears blurred her vision as she leaned in close to her son's delicate brow, her lips brushing his velvety skin. "I'm so sorry," she whispered in a ragged voice. "I'm so sorry." Then the barricade gave way fully with a splintering crash, raining debris across the floor. The first of the undead horrors came lurching through like a breaching whale, arms outstretched and jaws agape to release a guttural moan that chilled Sarah's very soul. It seemed to be staring right at her, yellowed eyes straining in rotted sockets as more and more of the living dead packed in behind it. She had nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, clutching Liam close as the groaning tide bore down on them. Maybe in those final eternal moments, she prayed they might somehow be reunited in whatever cold oblivion awaited them both. It was the only comfort she could hope for, a fleeting reprieve from the nightmare. The first desiccated hands grasped at her, pulling her into their relentless embrace. She heard Liam cry out in terror, his wails mercifully drowned out in the deafening roar of her own screams. In that final gnashing, tearing darkness, Sarah clung to just one thought. This was only the beginning.